So the reason I'm making a part two to my question of is Gen Z boring is because I realized I forgot to bring up some other points because I got lost in the sauce. To well, that's yeah, I got lost in the sauce when I was making that video, but I forgot 2 points that I wanted to bring up, and I'm gonna make those points now because well, no, I think they're important for that question of whether or not my generation is boring. So my first thing comes with the idea that Gen Z is a conformist generation. I've heard people mention this a lot that my generation is very conformist. We go very much along with whatever the status quo is, and I can see it. I can see that being a fair point to make because obviously you can look at how America is and really how the rest of the world is right now and see that most of the things that are being pushed in the media is very much like I guess pro authority. Yeah, it's just very pro establishment. No, right wing politics is very much conformist, and not most, but a good piece of my generation is like that. But at the same time, there is also a good chunk of my generation who is very against this, and who is very anti-authority, and who choose not to engage in those kind of establishment behaviors. So, I think when you ask that question is if Gen Z is conformist, when we go along with the idea of whether or not Gen Z is boring, that it really depends on who you're talking to. I think if you go up to New York, you'll find that for the most part, the youth basically is not very conformist at all. Whereas if you go down south, they are very conformist for the most part, and of course it also relates to different cultures and whatnot. Depending on how you were raised, you might tend to be more conformist or more anti-authority or whatever. So I think it's a bunch of different factors. So I don't think it's very fair to try and put it all on one generation. That one generation is just all like this. Considering how fractured we are as a whole. I mean, I think most of us don't really tend to get along because of that now, and you can see that in the way we interact with each other. I think most of us don't really tend to like one another because we are so different to where we can't really mingle. But again, that depends on who you're talking to. Some people are very. It's kind of like introverts and extroverts. Extroverts have an easier time interacting with people than introverts do. So, I think when it comes to the idea of conformity, it's a very hard topic or a very hard thing to pin down because what exactly does it mean to be a conformist? What exactly does it mean to be a rebel or an anti-authoritarian? Because those things can change as time goes on. I mean, the boomers in the 60s will be very conformist are very conformist today, but back then when they were young they were very anti-establishment, right? And that's important to bring up too. Also, on the topic of people thinking that Gen Z is conformist, one of the things that people mentioned was partying and how we don't tend to really like partying. The idea that it came to is that in order for somebody to be a conformist, they would have to go along with the status quo. And from what I can understand, partying and going out every weekend or every night and interacting with people nonstop was like the thing to do. It was very much the conformist thing to do. And so, with that being said, if we are not going out and doing all these things that older generations used to do, would that therefore make us not authoritarian or not conformist because we refuse to go out and engage with the things that older generations used to do? I'm just posing the question here. Like, I'm not saying that there's a definitive answer to that. I'm just saying, I'm just putting it out there that, it's a little hypocritical when we think about it. The other point I wanted to bring up was the internet. I know I mentioned the internet in the first part, but one thing that I forgot to mention was that the internet basically shines a light on everybody. I think we all know this. Everybody is on the internet, or most people are on the internet, and we can all see each other and just living our lives, right? Back in the day when the internet wasn't prevalent, you couldn't really get a light on someone's entire life like that. You couldn't do that. But nowadays you can, and I think what people are mistaking as Gen Z being boring is just that people are boring in general. Nobody's exciting 24/7. I'm not going out 24/7. Sometimes I have to do my laundry. Sometimes I have to clean the dishes or whatever else, right? If we were all interesting 24/7, I think, we would all just be neglecting to do whatever responsibilities that we have. And most people don't consider responsibilities to be cool, if we're being honest, especially when you're younger too, and I think that the whole idea of Gen Z being boring has been kind of confused with the reality, which is that most people are boring in general. Most people are not really that interesting, and most people aren't really that out there, if we're being completely honest with ourselves. Most people aren't going out every Friday night or every weekend or every day, and most people aren't, having random hookups, and most people aren't, getting with whoever at whatever time, or doing the most interesting things or whatever else you could think of. Most people are just going through their day-to-day lives and just living life as most people do, within the rat race, basically. And I think that when we got our hands on the internet and we put our whole lives out there, people, I guess kind of realized that most people really just aren't that interesting when you think about it. But because it was mostly just us putting our lives out there, because most older people just don't do that. Most older people aren't putting their lives out there entirely. They kind of just conflated with the idea that, Gen Z or the youth is just boring as a whole, which is not true. Most people are boring in general. I'm not street performing right now, and street performing is one of the most interesting things I think a person could do, but I'm not doing that 24/7. I don't have that ability to go out every day. Sometimes I get tired, sometimes I get sick, and I'm just not able to perform. Well, right now it's summer, and I'm not able to get to Manhattan and play in Central Park like I would like to do. So I have to find something else to do, like YouTube videos, and that basically means that I'm boring by my own standards. But it's not because I'm boring, because I'm just am boring. It's just that's just where I'm at right now. That's how most people are. Most people aren't able to be interesting. We all have responsibilities, and we all have things we have to take care of. And when you shine a light on someone's life 24/7, you're gonna find that there's not really that many interesting parts of somebody's life. The interesting parts are the only ones we remember, because the daily stuff is so monotonous that we don't even consider it. When I saw those videos of the millennials and older people in general talking about how boring we are, and how they used to party a lot, and they used to do random hookups and sneak out of the house at night. That was just interesting parts of their lives that they were mentioning. They're not going to talk about all the times they had to do the dishes or the laundry, or every morning when they had to wake up to go to work, whatever they were doing during work, because no one wants to hear about that. No one cares about what you did at work today, or 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever. People only want to hear the interesting stuff, because the interesting stuff's the only stuff that lasts. Boring things aren't going to last. And so they tell all these stories about how better things were and how interesting and cool they were, because that's the only stuff that really matters at the end of the day. Because who cares about how many times you had to do the dishes? I'm bringing up dishes a lot. I just did the dishes, and that's all that's on my mind right now. But normal chores, normal things that you do, normal responsibilities are interesting to people, and so they tend to make themselves more interesting than they are, because no one really cares about the times that you weren't interesting. I think that's basically all I have to say about it, really. If I ever make any other points, I guess there'll be a part 3 to this video. I hope there's not going to be a part 3, because I think I made up pretty much all the points that I want to make with this, and I feel pretty satisfied with where it's at right now. So, yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that. See ya.